They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And guys, we have a really special guest today, someone who has quite the story to tell. Sarah McAbee is the co-founder and executive director of Stand in the Gap. She is the wife of the former Williamson County Sheriff, Ronald McAbee, who was convicted and sentenced, if you can believe it, to 70 months in prison for the events that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. This has been such an incredible story for the last 3.5 years in our country. A lot of innocent people have had their lives torn apart by our weaponized government system of justice. So let's welcome into the program. You can check out our website, by the way, sarahmcabee.us, at sarahmcabee_US on X. Sarah, thanks so much for being with us. Welcome to the Happy Women Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on and giving me an opportunity to share a story.
You deserve more than an opportunity. What you and your family have been through is pretty incredible. Before we start, though, we always like to kind of get the backstory, how we get to where we are today. Tell us about you, your husband, and just kind of set the stage to before we get to what happened on January 6th.
Absolutely. We lived an all-American lifestyle. I mean, we were high school sweethearts, grew up in East Tennessee, got married. He was a law enforcement officer and I worked in corporate America. We just lived the white picket lifestyle. And he was invited to January 6th by a friend at the time. And he went to air his grievances with his government, as we are entitled to do per our Constitution. And he was a law enforcement officer of 7 years at the time. And in my opinion, he did what any man of honor and dignity would have done. He jumped into action when chaos was breaking out around him. He saved an officer who was down on the ground in distress, and he tried to save the life of Roseanne Boylan. And unfortunately, August of 2021, the FBI came and raided our home and took him, and he has been incarcerated ever since.
So I was utterly shocked to learn about some of the details of really what they have put him through. So one thing I think that really stood out for me in particular was the fact that you said he went for 597 days. Is that right? Where you weren't even allowed to visit him?
Yes, that is correct.
I just find that absolutely incredible. You said, and he's been moved 7 times. Is that still correct?
Actually, he's been moved now 11 times to, 12 times to 11 different facilities.
Wow. But I think the story that stood out the most for me when I was really interested to try to find out from you, where does this stand today? There was an incredible story where your husband was assaulted by a U.S. Marshal. Is that correct? Her name was Crystal Lancaster, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
So it actually was a DC guard, a jail guard, and it was Labor Day of 2022. So he had already been incarcerated for over a year at the time, and they were on 19 and 5. And so that means they were locked in their cells 19 hours a day and allowed out for 5 hours. So he was locked in his cell that morning, got out to walk 25 feet to the medication cart. Mind you, Crystal Lancaster was already banned from being in what we call the Patriot Pod in Washington, D.C. because of her actions towards other January 6th defendants. But it was a holiday, and that means admin staff is not in there. And so she just did whatever she wanted, and she was in there wreaking havoc. He walked out of his cell without a COVID mask on because, as I said, he had already been in there for a year and lived in that particular pod. They weren't even allowed to leave there, and was going to take oral medication. And she told him to put a mask on, and he said no. And he proceeded to the medication cart, and she jumped in between him and pushed him towards a chair, and he brushed past her. And when he brushed past her, because she moved towards him, he moved or touched her sleeve, and she said that he assaulted her. And she told the nurse to deny him his medication. He said no, that he wanted to take it. She then deployed pepper spray within an inch of his face. They handcuffed him. As they were handcuffing him, she ran towards him again and sprayed an entire can of OC spray in his face. And then they threw him in a hot shower, not able to decontaminate. And then their way of taking care of it was to throw him in solitary confinement.
So can I just follow up, Jen, with one more thing? So Congressman Troy Nehls, the Republican from Texas, has been doing a great job chasing this down. So I saw the testimony where he confronted Director Davis from the U.S. Marshal Service and said, I want to know what happened. You know, come back. I want visual detail. I want to know. And as far as I know, the U.S. Marshal Service never came back to him with the information he wanted. Is that still the case?
Yes, that's correct. For January 6 defendants that haven't been convicted, they are in U.S. Marshal custody. So even though he was in Washington, D.C. for 26 months, for those 26 months, he was held in U.S. Marshal custody. And so technically, it's their responsibility to take care of their detainees. And they are not convicted at that point. And so, no, that video evidence, I have not even seen that video evidence. We do have a lawsuit against Lancaster and the facility, but it hasn't even come out. It hasn't even gone to discovery yet. And you all know how civil lawsuits work. It's going to take forever for it to work through this process. And it's just terrible because what you hear about what we call the DC Gulag, the DC jail, everything is absolutely true. What you hear about it was 597 days before I was able to see my husband. And at first it was behind glass. I had to travel to Washington, D.C. from Nashville for a 30-minute visit behind glass for the first time. And they were denied haircuts. They couldn't clip their nails, no religious services. They weren't allowed to go outside. I mean, this is what happens in third world countries. It doesn't happen to American citizens in our own nation's capital.
From politicians who want to shut down Guantanamo Bay, but yet they're treating our own American citizens worse than that. I mean, truly, it's disgusting to hear about this. Before we go any further, I just want to bounce back a little bit because you talked about his movements on January 6th. What did he see? So he basically, his only involvement there, he was there, obviously, like a lot of people, and he was helping with the people who were injured. Is that really the primary extent of his involvement in January 6th from your perspective? Yes. Or from,
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen every second of video evidence, and he never went inside the Capitol. He was at the Lower West Terrace Tunnel, and he was standing to the right side of it and saw an officer get drug out into the crowd. And there was another officer, Metropolitan Police Officer Andrew Waite, who was lying on the ground on his back, and the police officers weren't helping him. So he yelled, "You have a man down," and he went to go pick up that officer. Every time he went to pick up the officer, they charged him with assault. And it doesn't matter what sort of video evidence that you have. It doesn't matter that a police officer thanked him for his help that day. It doesn't matter that the police officers, two different ones, Carter Moore and Devontae Powell, assaulted him with a baton, busted his head open, and he was communicating with them. He said, "I'm one of you. I'm helping you. I know how to give help." He's yelling at Lila Morris to stop killing Roseanne Boylan. 7 minutes of his life from the time that he stepped in to the time a Good Samaritan took him out of the tunnel to go get medical help at a tent. And he waited 26 months for trial. He waited 31 months for sentencing. He was the only one in his case to take it all the way to trial. And he did that because he wanted to get somewhat justice for Roseanne Boylan, because a lot of people don't know that she died that day. And he did it at the expense of himself because he knew going to trial what it would do. They tried to absolutely destroy him every which way possible. They stacked every charge that they could against him. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter that the officer that thanked him took the stand, testified on his behalf. Didn't matter that the video evidence of the officer that they said that he assaulted acknowledged that he was helping him and told him to help him back up to get to the line of duty of officers. It just doesn't matter when you are judged by a day on a calendar versus your actions that day, because in Washington, D.C., those people are victims. Every person that was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, except for the defendants themselves, are named victims in these cases, yet those are the people deciding their fate.
It's no secret. The world's unpredictable. One moment, everything's fine, and the next, the power's out, and the cell towers are down. But with a satellite phone from sat123.com, you don't have to be cut off from the world. No matter where you are or what's happening, Sat123 keeps you connected. Whether you're deep in the mountains, on the road, or dealing with a natural disaster, your satellite phone will work when nothing else does. This is about being prepared. Sat123.com is family owned, American built, and focused on keeping you safe. They understand that in today's world, connection is more than convenience. It's essential. So here's the deal. Go to sat123.com and use code Katie for $25 off your first purchase. Don't get caught off guard. Stay connected. Stay prepared with Sat123.
And just real quick, Katie, let me just jump in because one more question on that front. I have had a lot of people in Los Angeles who were at the rally that have told me their stories, and they had the FBI violently come through their house. And there's one that was so ridiculous. Her house was tossed, and what they took out was a Trump bumper sticker out of the house after the FBI went through because she was at January 6th. It's really stunning. What was that morning like in August when they came to your house?
They actually took him at work as he was walking into work. I was not home. I had already left I was on the West Coast for work traveling. And I tried to call my husband that morning and I couldn't get a hold of him. And then I would say probably about 2 hours later, the FBI called me and told me that they had apprehended my husband and they were raiding my house, and they raided our house for about 5 hours. I flew home that evening, and the first thing I had to do was put my house back together because the FBI had left it in shambles.
So you've obviously been living this every day, and you've obviously been probably sort of pouring through the evidence. Where do you stand right now on what actually happened on January 6th? Are you of the belief that that day was sort of engineered? What's your thinking?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I believe that the government had several fallbacks to it, because the evidence that has come out now about the agents that were on the ground that day from all kinds of three-letter agencies to the infiltration of different groups prior to that, from confidential human sources to the Azov Brigade that was on the ground to the DNC pipe bomb. You know, American citizens deserve to have answers about January 6th. We're 3.5 years into this. It's the largest manhunt in FBI history, the largest prosecution in the Department of Justice's history. And Merrick Garland about 2 months ago came out and said, take January 6 defendants as an example if you're going to protest the 2024 election results. That's not the way it should be in America. We have a Declaration of Independence. We have a Constitution. We have rights as Americans. But if you don't align politically with those that are in charge, they are absolutely going to destroy you.
You know, I think the thing that is, there's so many things disturbing about this, but that we heard from the FBI director just a few days ago, and he all but admitted that there were at least, I think, 150 undercover FBI agents in the crowd on January 6th, and that they were all there wearing their Trump gear and their Trump T-shirts. And we're still not going to get the Inspector General's report until after the election. Sarah, how does this make you feel? I know for all of us, and you have more skin in the game than all of us right now because your husband is being falsely imprisoned. There's such a distrust, and it was such a wake-up call. We all as Americans, I think, wanted to trust our government. And now we see them actively working against 50% of the country. If they're not afraid of what could be in that report, we should be able to see it pre-election, not until 30 days after.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the feelings that I have is it's disheartening, honestly. This continues to go on because American citizens allow it to go on. Because what January 6th did was it instilled fear into the American people to never rise up, to never question the government, because that's all they did. All they did was show up to support their representatives to do the right thing and send the votes back to the state to look at the evidence. But instead, chaos broke out. And like I said, they had several lines to break, to have the chaos break out and it unfold. I think they wanted a bloodbath that day. I think they wanted more than 4 American citizens to die that day. And that is why you look at the Summer of Love, you look at the inauguration of Trump in 2017, all of those things have very similar things in common, but those people are still not sitting in jail. They had their due process rights. But what it's done is American citizens now sit back and say, well, look what they've done to them. I can't lose my job. I can't lose my house. I can't lose my car. I have children. So I'm just going to let it continue on. And it all goes back to the saying, I didn't do anything for these people, for that group of people, and now they're coming after me and there's nobody to do anything. That's what we're at. We are where we are in a country because of apathy, and that's enough good people sitting back doing nothing because it doesn't affect them personally yet.
So one of the things that's obviously so striking about the J6 prisoners is the fact that their civil rights have been so terribly trampled on. Why hasn't this gone to the Supreme Court?
You know, that's a good question. A lot of attorneys don't want to touch January 6th because it's too political. Very early on, I had a very well-known, prominent attorney in Washington, D.C. tell me, Sarah, I have no doubt you're telling me the truth. I have no doubt. I haven't looked at the evidence. I don't know you from Adam, but I have no doubt you're telling me the truth. But I will never represent your husband because I run in the same circle as the prosecution and the judges, and I'm not willing to lose those relationships. But they can represent murderers. They can represent rapists. They can represent all of the true terrorists, but they won't represent January 6th defendants. And so we are just, left out. We are a forgotten society. We are a forgotten group because people want us to move on from January 6th. Listen, I would love to move on from January 6th as well. But my husband sitting in prison for 70 months, having his rights absolutely violated, not just him. There's over 250 American citizens still sitting in jail in regards to January 6th. And regardless of their actions that day, every person in America has constitutional rights, and those have absolutely been obliterated for them.
And look, it sounds like your husband was just there trying to do the right thing. And I believe most people were there caught up in a really bad situation. And we could talk about the possibility that it was all engineered. Even for the people who were the worst offenders, who were destroying property. I live in Los Angeles. George Gascon is the DA. People do more every single day in Los Angeles and are not even given a charge of a misdemeanor as opposed to what actually happened at the Capitol. I think that's what's so infuriating is that we can charge and prosecute and throw away the key on people like your husband, yet there are real criminals out there who are getting away with literal murder who aren't being prosecuted by far left DAs or by our Justice Department. How is your husband's state of mind right now? And tell us some of the stories. I'm sure that you've connected with other January 6 families as well. So tell us some of the things about how you might be supporting each other.
Thank you for asking about him. I believe it's by the grace of God that these individuals are going to come out. They're going to come out smelling like smoke. I don't think they're going to come out unscathed, but I do believe that these individuals were chosen for such a time of this to not only expose the corrupt Department of Justice, but what they've exposed with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the way these individuals are treated is just, it's inhumane. It's not American. And Republicans are the worst when it comes to prison reform. This is a very democratic thing on the way these individuals are treated, but Democrats don't want to touch it because it's January 6th. Republicans don't want to touch it because it's January 6th. And that's just not the way it should be. I mean, honestly, January 6th defendants and their families, the ACLU won't touch it, the Amnesty Project, the Innocence Project. And that's why I had to start a nonprofit. I was in the corporate world. I never thought my life would look like this, but I knew that if they were going to go after somebody like my husband, that I honestly believe he would have done the exact same thing, whether it happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6th on the Capitol steps, or it happened in a Chick-fil-A parking lot in Nashville, because his actions that day were absolutely heroic. And I will never stop being proud of him for doing what he was absolutely trained to do, because what January 6th showed is that our nation's capital is protected by an untrained police force. Because sure, there were bad actors even in the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department, but the majority of them, they just were reacting to what was going on around them because they were set up as well. And so, starting this nonprofit to help defendants and their family, it was 597 days till I saw my husband. That means that these fathers weren't seeing their children, spouses weren't seeing each other, parents were passing away, grandparents were passing away, and they couldn't see them. We couldn't even see them via video. And so after Troy Nehls went into D.C. and they finally got granted in-person visitation after 2 years, they couldn't financially afford to fly from all over America for a 1-hour visit on a Friday afternoon. And so that's really what sparked the nonprofit to reunite these families through visitation. And then we realized that there were a lot of things missing, including appellant attorneys. So 18 months into this, we had private attorneys, and a well-known attorney in D.C. said, Sarah, what are you doing? You've been paying for private attorneys for 18 months. Your husband's still sitting in jail. They won't even negotiate a plea deal with him. He's going to be found guilty. It's a 99.6 conviction rate in Washington, D.C. What are you doing? He's going to be sitting in jail. And so he said, fire your private attorneys, get a public defender, and save your money for sentencing and appeals. And I was like, thank you for being honest with me for the first time in 18 months. And so we did just that. And we saved our money for sentencing and appeals. And that's where we're at right now in our case. But you have all of these defendants that cashed out their 401ks, sold their cars, sold their houses, all of their assets. Their loved ones worked 2 full-time jobs to make ends meet and to pay for attorneys. And they got convicted on all counts. And now they're sitting in jail with no hope because appellant attorneys cost just as much, if not more, as defense attorneys. And so we said, why are we lining the pockets of these defense attorneys, regardless if they are good or not, when you're going up against a rigged system? And so we started to fund appellant attorneys. But I think what makes us different from all other January 6th organizations is we're looking long term, because if regardless what happens in 25 days, President Trump gets in and pardons these individuals, the 4 years of their life and what has happened to them, they're not getting that time back. No. And that's where we really, as Americans, have to step in. And so we launched the Road Home Project, where we are partnering in Texas with a bed and breakfast of a January 6th defendant, actually. And we're building tiny homes for these families to come down where, regardless of their charges, regardless of what happens, whether they get pardoned or not, these employers are going to hire them, and they are able to start the healing process and to get their life back. Because, as I said, the PTSD of what's going to come out for these individuals, I mean, you look at the numbers and it's staggering. There is a 72% of these individuals are veterans and law enforcement officers. 92% of January 6 defendants are white Christian males. That's who they are going after, because they are absolutely terrified of them. But we, as we said with, stand in the gap, it's a very biblical thing, but they stood in the gap for us on January 6th. A lot of us wanted to be there and couldn't be there for whatever reason. It's time for American citizens to stand in the gap for them and walk them home on this journey.
And just real quick, Katie, I'm so sorry, because I know we want to get into stand in the gap, but just for clarification, your husband is out when, if everything stands as it is today?
Sometime in 2026.
Unbelievable. And would he be available to be hired back as a police officer, or is that over for him now?
No, his career's gone. Every charge they gave him was a felony. 6 felonies now.
Wow. So you're saying, and I think it's such a powerful message, that it's time for Americans to stand up to defend these people. And really what it's also about is for Americans to stand up and defend these fundamental American principles. Tell me concretely, what can Americans do?
It all goes back to putting your money where your mouth is. And, I'm sick of begging for money. I'm sick of, having these conversations with people, but that's what it's down to. I mean, the government comes to take, steal, and destroy. They have destroyed these people financially. I mean, you think about it. They literally took the breadwinners of these families and threw them into jail. And they've been sitting there. Some of them have been sitting there for almost 4 years without a trial. And their families, life goes on. They've lost their homes. They've lost their cars. I work 2 full-time jobs to just make ends meet on our end to keep things going for us as a family. And there's children growing up without their fathers. We really need to put ourselves in the shoes of January 6 defendants and their families, because that's if we don't feel their hurt, it's never going to matter to other people.
Okay, so I want to give you, in our final few minutes here, Sarah, I want to talk, really dig in, because I know we mentioned it at the beginning and you just mentioned it right now, but stand in the gap was what? Because we just talked about your husband and how he was doing. You must have felt, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, speak to this, but you must have felt incredibly helpless and frustrated. And not only is there the pressure of your husband being gone, but now you have to figure out, as you mentioned, how to keep yourself going and figure out a way to get a defense for him. Where did you birth the idea of Stand in the Gap? How did that happen as your process was going on with all of this?
It came from having no one to talk to. Representatives didn't want it. We're from Tennessee, and we think Tennessee is a great red state. None of our representatives will touch us. Andy Ogles is our congressional member. He won't have a conversation with me. Marsha Blackburn has said, I will not have a conversation with Sarah McAbee. Why? I'm not asking you for anything other than some recognition of what's going on. And that's the thing. People don't think they're touched by January 6th, but they absolutely are, because we are test subjects for what they want to do to all Americans. Every state has a January 6th defendant. There is now over 1,500 January 6th defendants in America. They are your neighbors. They are your family members. They are from our communities. And for us to sit back and do nothing, shame on us as Americans. And it was birthed because no organizations would touch us. You have all these organizations. I mean, you have Kamala Harris out there saying bail funds for the summer of love, yet these individuals aren't even getting bond. But we can't make our ends meet. Our houses are going into foreclosures. We've had to sell our cars. Our kids are not even, being able to be taken care of at Christmas time. I mean, it is absolutely atrocious what is happening to American citizens. For some of them, merely just going to January 6th. Some of them did engage in things that they shouldn't have engaged in, but they were put in situations that they should have never been put in. Because if you look at the bad actors on January 6th, those individuals aren't sitting in jail. Those individuals haven't been named. They are out there living their absolute best life while they have pick and choose the people that they wanted to go after. And it should be a wake-up call to all Americans to get involved in some sort of level. We can't stop talking about it. If you can merely write these individuals and let them know that you're going to help carry their cross and their burden until they get home, and you're going to help take care of their family. Because if we came together as Americans, January 6th, it wouldn't be going on. This persecution would not continue to be going on if we came together and held our elected representatives accountable.
So I think one of the big problems is the story just doesn't get out there. We know that, I mean, you talk about the fact that lawyers won't touch it, but I think at the same time, a lot of the media won't touch it. One of the people who I think has done such a good job in bringing this to the attention of Americans is Nick Searcy with his two films. I mean, I have to say, when he came out with the first one, I was just utterly appalled by the images of these SWAT teams descending on families in the suburbs and showing up with, 20 members of the FBI with assault rifles. It's just absolutely, and armored vehicles. I mean, it was really stunning. Can you think of who else besides Nick Searcy is out there really telling the story and educating Americans about it?
Steve Baker with The Blaze is doing a wonderful job. Joe Hanneman, who was initially with the Epic Times and now is with The Blaze, they have done a lot of good work when it comes to factual things about January 6th, not just the emotional side of what these families are going through, but uncovering things like what's going on with the DNC pipe bomb, undercover agents, about the Capitol Police lying, about what's even going on in these trials. Those individuals have truly taken a stand, sometimes at the expense of themselves. Steve Baker's a January 6th defendant himself now and was perp walked by the FBI just for show. But they're not allowing the fear to I will say they are walking by faith and not by fear. And that's what we must do as Americans, because we are living in very interesting times, which is a curse. We should be wanting to live in times of peace, but we can't continue to sit back. And knowledge is power. We need to have these conversations. I'm Southern, and so we are very much into the churches and in our faith. And I ask all the time, where are the churches? Why aren't you standing up for our rights as Americans? When a house burns down in a community, they're the first ones there with donations. When somebody is in the hospital, they're the first one there with dinner. But January 6th defendants, for some reason, we have a scarlet letter on us, and we are shunned in every which way. But American citizens need to come together. We need to continue to talk about this, and knowledge is power, and we need to arm ourselves with that to have these crucial, uncomfortable conversations.
How can people help you out, Sarah, with Stand in the Gap? Can people donate? Can they get involved? I think sharing messaging is the key. So many people are afraid to share messages on social media, but the media is not going to touch this. Our elected officials are not going to touch this. You said it's a stigma. It is a scarlet letter. You're right. So what can we do to share messages and to tell these stories?
Absolutely. My website, sarahmcabee.us, has all of the video evidence that we talked about for my husband. It has the timeline, more about our story, but on there is a link to Stand in the Gap, or you can go to standinthegap.foundation, because we knew that this was bigger than us. And if we were called to be in this position, we had to be a voice for the voiceless, because they took their voice away, and these family members are scared. They're just trying to do what they can to make ends meet. But that's where we come in, and we absolutely tell their stories, get it out there, because as I said, there's 1,500 American citizens that are going through this, and each of their stories are unique and they need to be heard.
Thank you for that. Again, the website is sarahmacabee.us. Stand in the Gap is the organization. You can give her a follow on social media as well, Sarah McAbee _US. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story. We'll be praying for you and your husband. And please keep us posted on what's going on in that respect. And hopefully, President Trump is elected, you will be able to see your husband sooner than next year. Hopefully.
And there will be justice.
And justice for sure. Sarah, thank you so much. Again, sarahmacabee.us, and Stand in the Gap is the organization, Sarah McAbee _US on X. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us. Those 5-star reviews really help. Please share Happy Women with your friends as well. You can connect with us at SalemPodcastNetwork.com to find all of our platforms, YouTube, Spotify, all of the places you get your podcast. And check out Katie's website, katiegorka.org. Get her book. It's called Next Gen Marxism. You can find her on Facebook. Just search for Catherine Gorka, or on X at Gorka Katie. You can find me on social media as well at Jennifer Horn Radio on Instagram and Facebook, Jennifer Horn on Truth and on X. Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.